and welcome to day 3 of the Natural Hazards Workshop. My name is Kathleen Tierney, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be moderating this session featuring the Bill Anderson Fund Fellows. Just a little background. William A. Anderson, fondly known to everyone as Bill, was a sociologist who was a member of the second generation of hazard and disaster researchers. He had a distinguished career as a professor, first of all, at Arizona State University, then moving to Washington, D.C. to become the founding director of the American Sociological Association's Minority Fellowship Program. He had a long career at the National Science Foundation, where he helped to build the disaster and hazards research community in the United States. This was followed by a period at the World Bank with the Prevention Consortium, and finally at the National Academy of Sciences. Following Bill's untimely death in 2013, his widow, Norma, founded the William A. Anderson Fund, known as the BAF, or the Bill Anderson Fund, in 2014. The goal of the BAF is to support and mentor graduate students of color who are going to help make the hazard and disaster research community look more like America and more like the world. There are now a total of 40 alumni of the Bill Anderson Fund, as well as 50 current fellows. And you're going to be hearing from 7 of those fellows and alumni in just a minute. As you know by now, the Disaster Dash is an activity at the Hazards Workshop that raises funds for the Bill Anderson Fund. And if you're not taking part, or if you haven't contributed to the Disaster Dash, we hope that you will. So before our talks, I'd like to thank Margaret Watts Romney, give a big shout out to Margaret for the help that she provided with these speakers in recording their talks, their presentations. What we're going to be doing is hearing from 7 of the Bill Anderson Fund Fellows, and they have pre-recorded their talks. So the talks are going to be 5 minutes long, lightning talks. That'll take up 35 minutes, after which we'll have questions and answers as time permits. I want to briefly introduce the 7 speakers in alphabetical order. First is Jennifer Blanks, a doctoral student in the Urban Development and Regional Science program at Texas A&M University. Oronda Drakes, a geographer with the U.S. Geological Survey. Sierra Horn, a doctoral student in systems engineering at the University of Virginia. Cassandra Jean, a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Sciences at the University of Washington. Next, Taylor Leitner, a PhD candidate in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech. Carlo Chunca Pizarro, a PhD student in the Urban Planning and Public Policy program at the University of California, Irvine. And Valerie Washington, a PhD candidate in the Department of Industrial and Operations Engineering, University of Michigan. And now we're going to be watching these 7 lightning talks. Thank you.
Jen, we're not, the audio isn't coming through.
Oh, it's because I was muted. Sorry.
Thank you for restarting this one. Thank you.
Yes, I will right now.
Beautiful.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah, got it. Thank
It's
you.
2014, and I'm a civil engineering sophomore at the University of Maryland, about to sit and learn the small classroom designated for my engineering for sustainability course I've been doing all semester. As usual, I'm expecting to dread what I'm about to learn because it's so technical that it goes over my head. However, my professor shocks me this day. She proceeds to show us how the levee failures in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina were caused by poor technical design. Of course, I perked up because this was outside of her typical confusing technical lectures. But it was also because we all knew how devastating these levee failures were for poor Black people in New Orleans. We also had pictures of the numerous houses submerged in water, only their roofs exposed, people on top of them, begging in the sweltering heat to be rescued. This was the first time that someone connected dots for me, that civil engineers, people in the profession I was studying to be in, have the power to cause such devastation for those most marginalized in our society. I immediately felt anger and sadness because I believed and still believe that everyone has the fundamental right to quality and safe infrastructure, and that civil engineers are the ones responsible for making that happen. Fast forward to graduate school. I'm at the University of Virginia, where I'm continuing to keep this belief in mind and apply it to my dissertation research on infrastructure inequality. I've been told by a few professors that highlighting infrastructure inequality isn't engineering, and that infrastructure inequality isn't an environmental justice issue. I'm thinking to myself, my undergraduate professor made me see that there's something wrong in how we approach civil engineering design. But now, here are these other professors telling me that nothing needs to be fixed. Do they not recall the devastation caused by the levee failures in New Orleans? Do they not understand that large water infrastructure systems like those levees continue to cause disasters in the wake of climate change? Do they not know that during this time in climate change exacerbation, we need to be really concerned about our dams? Within the last 3 years, there have been back-to-back dam failures that have caused tragedies for communities downstream of them. For example, the Spencer Dam in Nebraska fell in 2019 because of intense rainfall and snowmelt, which led to the presumed death of one man as he was never found after floodwaters receded. His property was also swept away like it never existed. In 2020, the Edenville Dam in Michigan failed, caused another dam downstream of it to fail as well. And together, they damaged 250 buildings and costed affected communities $200 million. Finally, there was a Lake Bella Vista Dam in Arkansas that failed just last year, which damaged bridges, led people to be water rescued from their vehicles and homes. These dam failure events do not have near the toll the levee breaches had on New Orleans. But why does it seem like we have to wait until one does to take preventative action? Communities are still financially burdened, broken up, erased, and traumatized because of the inaction to appropriately maintain these water infrastructure systems. We remember the pictures of Katrina and the communities, families, and homes that were ruptured when the levees failed. Imagine your community, your family, and your home. Do you know if you live near one of America's thousands of dams? What would be lost if it failed? Do you hope that the civil engineers who designed it not only constructed it correctly, but also considered the communities, families, and homes around it as they did? Thank you for listening, and take care.
Imagine you live in Florida, and just 1 week after Hurricane Harvey, you're told another hurricane has formed in the Atlantic. As it continues to approach the coast of Florida over the next week, you see your grocery store shelves start to empty. Your local gas stations are sold out, and several of your neighbors are boarding up their windows in order to protect their homes. As you continue to observe those around you and discuss with family and friends, you begin to ask yourself what your next step should be. Should you evacuate immediately to avoid any possible danger? Should you wait and see how the forecast might change so that you can avoid missing any work or school? Days later, you turn on the news to find that the governor has warned those in an evacuation zone just a few miles away. Do not wait. Evacuate. Not tonight, not in an hour. You need to go right now. You begin to question what this could mean for your own safety. Could you also be at risk even though you aren't in an evacuation zone? Should you evacuate with them? Should you shelter in place to avoid getting stuck in hours of traffic? There are a lot of factors that influence people's decisions of whether or not to evacuate and the timing of that evacuation. While evacuation decisions made at the individual level might seem inconsequential, the impact that they can have on road networks can be substantial, especially when you consider the added traffic from those evacuating from outside of evacuation zones. In evacuation research, the estimates of the times and locations from which people evacuate are referred to as departure times. The most common approach to studying these departure times has been to survey individuals after a hurricane to ask what time they evacuated. A more recent approach uses cell phone location data, which has opportunities for studying these departures in real time. Current approaches use algorithms to determine the time of the evacuation and researcher judgment to determine the regions from which these evacuations began. As part of my dissertation research, I developed an algorithm that removes this human judgment and instead approximates both the times and locations of evacuations from anonymized location data sets. To do so, we look at past departure trends from a given area and use this as a basis of comparison for the departures that occur during the hurricane. With this information, we're able to identify areas where there was an increase in departures around the time of the hurricane. Combined with information about wind and flood risks, we're able to use mobile phone location data to identify hotspots where evacuations likely took place, including those from outside of evacuation zones. Once we do so, we can look closer at the departures that took place within that region to calculate how the number of departures changes over the course of the day. As a result, we're able to gain a better understanding of where evacuees are coming from and what time they get on the road. This can be used in the projection of traffic conditions, which emergency managers use to ensure that evacuees can safely exit the risk area before it becomes unsafe to be on the road. This information can also be used to inform how resources are allocated to decrease travel times, including changing the timing of traffic lights to prioritize the flow of evacuation traffic, implementing contraflow so that both sides of the road travel in the same direction, and informing the public when alternative routes are available with similar or lesser expected travel times or delays. So in the future, when you see your grocery store shelves start to empty, your local gas stations sold out, and several of your neighbors boarding up their windows in order to protect their homes, our research can help emergency managers by providing additional insights into evacuation behavior, and in turn help you with evacuating to safety. Thank you.
It's June 2020,
My phone is buzzing and the TV's on. I look to my roommate as we prepare our signs. I gotta make sure it's clear because I want to be heard even if I'm silent. We pack our bags, grab our keys and head to the door. Wait, don't forget your water bottle. You know it's gonna be hot. We live in Washington, D.C. The world is angry and we're ready to let the world and the White House know just how much Black lives matter. We march past thousands of bodies, many of them Black, screaming and mourning, continuously wiping sweat off their brows. Volunteers are passing out small fruits and water. If there's one thing that was competing with the roars of our voices, it was the heat. The day is done and we walk back home, reveling in the streets through the historic district, calling Chocolate City for its high concentration of Black folks, but because it's undergoing gentrification, it was rapidly turning into Cappuccino City. Black Lives Matter signs are posted all around these white-owned businesses, which took over old mom and pop stores, luxury condos next to the historic DC townhomes, and of course in the window of the Starbucks that popped up the year before. It's a wonder how Black Lives mattered at that moment. The contradiction, the confusion, but the heat, it was hot. Fast forward 2 years and I'm walking down another street. This time not with the crowd chanting in unison, but for leisure and exploration. The murals on the buildings look familiar as they're painted with Black and brown faces, similar to my home in DC. But this time I'm in the other Washington, Seattle that is. The sun is out, rain stopped and the gray skies are clear. I'm carrying my Howard water bottle and I could tell it's gonna be a beautiful summer. But I've heard stories about a heat wave so vicious that hospitals were even barely functioning. It made me nervous to hear. Good thing I have an AC in my apartment and for free. But that's not a standard here, as most people have to go out their way to buy or rent an AC unit. I continue my walk, admire the trees and feel the breeze. I look up and witness all of the beautiful LGBTQIA flags, with the Black and brown lines too. In almost every window, a Black Lives Matter sign. But I can count on my hands how many Black people I've walked past, and I've been walking for a mile. Where are all the Black people, I thought? I ask around and I find the community over in South Seattle. While talking to a friend, she tells me, we used to be in the Central District. That was our town and where I grew up. But if you took me over there now, I barely recognize it. She reminisces as she takes her hand to fan herself as it hits 70 degrees in the middle of March. All right, I have questions. I need to do more research, I thought. As the third fastest gentrifying city behind Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon, Seattle sits at a very interesting juncture. As the largest coastal city in the Pacific Northwest, and beyond its beautiful views, good quality of life, and reputation as one of the most liberal, expensive, and educated cities, Seattle also faces threats from earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, wildfire smoke, and now extreme heat. With Black people making up 7% of the entire population and 73% of the Black residents here with low to moderate income making around $43K versus the $105K that white residents make, I wonder, how are they maintaining their livelihood with these high rising costs? And with the summer months now upon us, how are they going to handle this heat? June 28, 2021 was the hottest day of the heat wave that hit the Pacific Northwest, and Seattle set for temperatures upwards of 108 degrees, an all-time record. As a public sociologist, I researched different stressors that impact historically marginalized groups and their lived experiences, especially in the face of disasters and environmental threats. Using an intersectional lens, I also interrogate systemic and institutional barriers that they face when dealing with these threats. So in line with my sociological imagination, which calls for us to be objective and equitable in our research, I wonder, as the Earth only continues to warm, what protective measures are in place for people who occupy highly vulnerable spaces? We know the multiple barriers to accessing resources like cooling centers and adequate park systems that Black people face nationwide. How are these needs, barriers, and concerns being considered by government officials responsible for increasing the community's adaptive capacity and ability to mitigate impacts from climate-related hazards. Impacted by historical segregatory practices, discriminations, and inequities, many Black Seattle residents have been forced to migrate to environmentally hazardous lands near Superfund sites. Now we're thinking of issues beyond the physical and lived environment, like proximity to healthcare professionals, to addressing issues like asthma and other respiratory issues, adequate access to education, trying to have some kind of economic stability, and of course, a fragile social community network. And looking over at the AC port in my apartment, it feels like AC or any cooling is a luxury, not a right. So now here I am walking around my living room, my phone is buzzing and the TV's on. This is loaded. And it's starting to get a little hot. And so I tell these stories and I ask others to tell their stories to remind us that environmental justice is social justice and that historically marginalized groups like the BIPOC community, LGBTQIA, women, children, elderly, immigrants, those experiencing homelessness, those whose language isn't English as their first language, they need to be heard, even if they're quiet, but especially if we're silenced.
Do you know you can learn a lot about a community or a society through studying their cemeteries? For example, archaeologists have carefully preserved and studied cultural resources like burial tombs, the Great Pyramids, and mummies to learn Egyptian history. While it is taboo to disturb these sacred tombs in Egyptian culture, centuries later, we are able to romanticize what day-to-day life was like for Egyptian royalty, servants, and other citizens. We've learned about their customs, daily routine, and even their dietary needs through studying the memorialized landscapes. Cemeteries allow us to fill in the gaps in American history. As a teaching assistant here at Texas A&M University, I had my own personal experience of learning American history by learning the true origin stories of Texas A&M for Love mascot Reveille in College Station City Cemetery. Reveille is worshipped on campus by students, faculty, and alumni to the point if she barks while class is in session, class is dismissed. Legend has it that the Corps cadets rescued a stray puppy from the side of the road while traveling back to campus and took her in. However, what's conveniently omitted from her origin story that's widely told on campus is the original owner of Reveille was a Black groundskeeper at Texas A&M named Eddie True Sr. and his family. To be fair, Texas A&M honors this legacy on campus with the statue of Reveille 1 in the athletic facility building, but it always amazes me that I learned a true, full story in a cemetery. Historic preservation in America has a similar pattern. We tend to preserve, honor, and spotlight certain parts of American history and landscapes at the expense of sacrificing other truths. Nearly 200 years ago, Seneca Village was a thriving, predominantly African-American community with homeowners, businesses, and other services to roughly 225 residents. This community provided Black residents in the area a safe space to escape violent racial tensions. Sadly, the city of New York acquired Seneca Village through eminent domain to begin construction in what would be modern-day Manhattan. The construction of Central Park meant the destruction and permanent burial of its cemetery. Unfortunately, African-American cemeteries can be impacted by a combination of systemic and environmental threats. Gullah Island in South Carolina is known for preserving more of its African linguistic and cultural heritage than any other African-American community in the United States. Once a predominantly African-American community, it is now an affluent white community with an expensive cost of living. Today, this culturally rich corridor is at risk of being lost from population displacement and impacts from hurricanes and rising sea levels. The goal of society is fighting to protect and preserve their cultural heritage through advocating for the protection of its cemetery. Why does it matter that cemeteries are destroyed? Well, they are non-renewable resources, meaning once they're destroyed, they cannot be replaced. Black cemeteries face a particular risk of being destroyed for various reasons, such as geographic location, erasure for development and resource exploitation, and population displacement. Cemeteries are an integral part of African American identity and resiliency in the face of natural disasters, during civil rights movements, and reclaiming physical landscapes. In addition to that, Black cemeteries fill in the gaps of true American history, because after all, it was the enslaved Black Americans who truly contribute to Americans' history. Laborers built iconic landmarks such as the White House and advanced agricultural practices still used today, such as crop rotation. As I continue to grow as a planner and preservationist, I challenge myself to carefully think through the relationship we all have with burial grounds. Why are they important to us as a society? And I encourage others to do the same. Framing cemeteries as a vulnerable landscape forces us to reimagine environmental and historic preservation land use planning in a way that makes it equitable and inclusive for all communities to protect their burial grounds for current and future generations to come. Thank you.
Imagine this. It's 2005. My country is in the middle of a devastating flood, one that's going to cost around 60% of its GDP. I have cousins, aunts, and uncles, all packed into my house. My house sits high up on stilts in a traditional manner of building, but theirs were newer homes built with ground level floors. As a result, they have chest deep water in the lower floors of their homes. One aunt finally evacuates after seeing snakes swimming in the living room. So everyone ended up at my house. Days turned to weeks. The last finally left after 3 months. Aid was delivered to my village. The distribution went house to house, but no one came to my home or to my neighbors. What was so different about us? Throughout this experience, one of the things that struck me most was how different groups of people had widely the similar experiences, the same physical event. At one village, the entire community was living on the highway, the only dry place left. Just down the road, there were people on jet skis making the most of their flood experiences. How could there be such different contexts to the same event? Why were people's experiences so drastically different? Later, as a researcher, communities told me about how emergency releases of water from conservancies in one administrative region affected residents in the neighboring regions. This gave some insight into the unintended consequences of decision making. The people deciding to release that water were only thinking about how it would affect persons living in their area of responsibility, not about the people on the other side of it. So I saw how people were left out of the decision-making process, how capacities used to combat the effects of one hazard can cause unintended impacts for other hazards, and how positive and negative effects of policies were based on where you looked and who you asked. I couldn't stop thinking about these communities and ended up studying social vulnerability, asking, what's causing this common yet disproportionate suffering? One of the challenges I found was that decision makers were relying on generic models to figure out where to put resources, where to invest in mitigation, how to spend the money. But these seldom accounted for the interrelated effects I saw across multiple hazard types and events. They tended to treat every place the same. But not every community sits on stilts like mine. Further, the focus was on such broad administrative scales that they couldn't reflect the different social dynamics occurring at local levels. like why my home and my neighbors were skipped during that flood. My research now aims to improve those decision making. I work with physical scientists and emergency managers to understand the hazards at play in their area and the types of resources and strategies in place to combat these. I also meet with communities to identify the livelihoods they employ, their interaction with other communities, and what all this means for how they are impacted by hazard events. I build maps and models of the physical and social conditions influencing the disasters we see unfold on TV and feel in person, using different combinations of metrics based on the types of hazards present, the lifestyles of the affected people, and all that information on community interaction. These are static, but they adapt and morph from place to place. Emergency managers and disaster response agencies have validated the accuracy of my models and highlighted the nuances it allows them to discuss, often with administrators far removed from and unfamiliar with the areas experiencing hazard events. With these new tools, more accurate and more appropriate information is provided to decision makers. I'm helping to answer, how could there be such different contexts to the same event? Why are people's experiences so drastically different? The answers can guide decision making to reduce and maybe even prevent the highly disproportionate suffering seen during disasters.
Before I begin, I want to set a trigger warning for death, gun violence, and deportation. Summer is near and you're getting ready to celebrate the end of the school year. You're thinking about picnics in the park, summer programs, and how high your utility bill will be this year due to heat waves. Suddenly you hear sirens multiplying around your neighborhood. You think it's a car chase, but that doesn't happen around here. You look at your phone and there's a notification that there's been a school shooting. A rush of adrenaline hits you like when the storm surge reaches the shore. You start to get your things together. You want to hurry, but you're trying to calm yourself down. You're finally in your cars, thinking of the worst, and start driving in desperation. Once you arrive at the school, hundreds of community members are in despair. You don't think this anxiety of wondering if the worst possible news can get any worse. But then you see a van with the letters CBP. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, or also known as the Immigration Police, is at the scene. You want to get closer and ask for updates, but you're afraid. You're afraid of the same officer involved in the deportation of a family member, the family next door, or even the parent of one of the children in the school could also be the same person telling you if your child is alive. A simple question like, can I see some identification, might prevent you from knowing. One day after the massacre at Uvalde Elementary, the Department of Homeland Security announced that CBP will not engage in deportation activities. In the community near the US-Mexico border, grief, trauma, and fear are complicated by deportation violence. Molded by systematic trauma, the presence of immigration officers can be triggering and affect behavior to participate during disaster preparedness and recovery. This was a reality to many families during the massacre in Uvalde, Hurricane Harvey, Flint, Michigan, and many disastrous events across the country. When the disaster strikes, undocumented communities are hit twice. For example, when Flint, Michigan was declared a national emergency, ministers went door to door to tell people to stop drinking water. However, undocumented families did not open their doors out of fear that the people knocking were immigration officers. For us that understand the daily fears of being undocumented, there has always been two disasters, one visible and one invisible, hidden in the shadows, situated as an oppressive system that makes undocumented communities feel like they're in a constant state of preparedness. And living in that state makes you feel like any disturbance is continuous and never ends. Deportations are not addressed as disastrous events in disaster literature, but they cause significant disruptions in undocumented communities. People's social behavior changes as they navigate hazardous conditions, and because of fear, they may refrain from participating in preparedness and recovery activities. As a result, disaster manager labels us as hard-to-reach communities, when in reality, they are unaware of the dangers we incur by putting ourselves in these governmental spaces. To understand how living undocumented means being in a constant state of preparedness, I turn to the 4 stages of the disaster management cycle. These stages are used by emergency managers to prepare for and respond to disasters. Similarly, undocumented communities act daily to prepare for and respond to deportations. Mitigation. As sanctuary activists organize to pressure City Council to approve sanctuary ordinances that reduce the risk of deportation. Preparedness. Participating in a Know Your Rights workshop to learn how to stay safe when ICE stop you is taking corrective action to ensure effective coordination during an incident with immigration. Response. Deportation defense organizations acting as emergency responders provide care and defend immigrants at risk of being taken to detention centers. Lastly, recovery can mean healing from the harm of deportation or detention violence, or learning how to adapt to a new life in a new country. With the increase of aggressive hazards due to climate change and the unlikelihood of the improvement of the U.S. immigration system, it is now more crucial than ever to identify inclusive approaches to disaster planning. Ongoing research illustrates that policymakers need to develop a deeper understanding of immigrant community knowledge to develop inclusive disaster plans. As planners, emergency managers, and community members, we must collaborate with communities by respecting and listening to their life experiences. Consider a future in which immigrants don't have to worry for their lives to attend a preparedness workshop. On addressing the absence of immigration in disaster research literature, centering undocumented community knowledge, and acknowledging our current immigration system as an environmental injustice. I seek to investigate this through an interpretive approach by investigating the inclusion and exclusion of undocumented communities in disaster planning. Through my scholarship, I hope that I can create collaborative, welcoming, and engaging planning spaces for undocumented communities to participate in the disaster planning process. By positioning our immigration system as an environmental and systematic injustice, we will work towards reducing suffering and uplift hope and preparedness for communities affected by multiple waves of disasters, especially for communities that recently lost their loved ones in multiple school shootings, environmental catastrophes, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
It's a hot summer day at Clemson University, and I am a program advisor for low-income first-generation students from what we call the Low Country in South Carolina. I, too, am a low-income first-generation student, and the only thing that separates me from the students that I am serving right now is my mom's decision to marry someone in the upper state. My mom was also from the Low Country, and she ran as far away from home as possible in hopes that I would have a better life than what she had growing up. There are drastically different opportunities and income levels in South Carolina solely on the region that you live in. Knowing that I am only one critical decision away from these students' experiences, I see it as an obligation to lift them up. These students that I'm serving in this summer program are more than just high schoolers from the Low Country of South Carolina. They are my little brothers and sisters, and all I want for them is to be successful with as limited barriers as possible. On this particular day, all of the program advisors are discussing their current majors and future plans. However, I am quite nervous. When it comes to me sharing my experiences as an engineer, I am both proud and conflicted. I am proud that at this point, I am now a third-year engineer with only a few credits left before I graduate. I am literally at the finish line. However, I'm so conflicted because this was not an easy feat. I have no idea how I'm going to use this degree to help me serve the communities that I care most about. There was not a day in my engineering program where I felt seen and heard as an engineer. I am this close to getting my degree, but still so far from knowing that this is exactly where I belong. Both inside and outside of the classroom, I received messages that I was far from what anyone considered to be an engineer. Despite preparing to be an engineer since the 6th grade, I'll be told by peers that I was only here because of affirmative action. Every first day of classes, I would just close my eyes and hope that I see at least 5 people of color, only to be disappointed every time. While students on campus are protesting to remove statues of people that thrived on lynching Black people, I received feedback on exams that said I was a failure over and over again, just for the grades to be curved in the end. At this point, I thought I was the only one that went through this, so I hid myself in isolation. Being the only Black woman in the classroom, I felt like I represented the entire Black community. One wrong perception from a group member would lie entirely on my community. So I would not miss a meeting, always had to take notes, and I needed to always go above and beyond, only to find out that I was left out of the group chat by mistake every single time. To avoid explaining why I didn't feel safe in my group projects to the professor, I just started begging to just work alone. In order to be what they needed me to be, I told myself that the only way I could survive was to leave behind my reality entirely and be in the engineering world where machinery and numbers were the only things that mattered. There was no room for mistakes. And trying to leave my world and be an imposter in this engineering world, I forgot what mattered most to me, and that is underserved communities like the ones I'm working for in this summer program. Of all of the engineering books that I've read, I saw no text that could actually help underserved communities like the ones in the low country of South Carolina. I was told by getting an engineering degree, I will be able to use math and science to improve society. However, this idea was never mentioned in the classroom. Our purpose as engineers was to improve industry and make more money. I was only able to cope through my engineering program by serving my community in student organizations and programs, such as the one that I'm working for right now. However, what I did not think about is that by being a program advisor for these students, I had become a role model. The last thing I wanted was someone aspiring to be like me, to have to endure the stripping of their identity and the distance from their community in order to fit this engineering mode that never had students like us in mind to begin with. The question is, how do I tell these students that if you decide to be an engineer, you will need endurance? And not the good kind, the kind that makes you depressed to be a Black woman, but at the very same time, happy that your Black girl magic has carried you this far. I wish I could have known that 5 years later, it would be a refreshing spring day at Virginia Tech. I am now a graduate teaching assistant for a disaster resilience and risk management program in a room full of urban planners, engineers, sociologists, geologists, educators, and much more from all over the globe. In this classroom, we are discussing what it means to be an interdisciplinary researcher in our respective fields. I'm reminded of that nervousness that I felt with talking to my students. When it comes to my time to speak, I don't know how to finally reveal that I have been an imposter this entire time. I go over my response over and over again in my head, hoping to be ignored and forgotten, only to be disappointed when a teacher says, "Taylor, do you have any thoughts that you would like to share with the class?" I tighten my jaw, I survey the room, and I sit on my hands and I just say it. I feel like I've never had a place to call my home in engineering. And I'm here in this space to freely think about problems and not necessarily my professional identity. The entire group stares at me for what feels like an eternity, and the guy beside me says, "Thank you for saying this." Until you formulated those words, I too didn't have the words for my space in geosciences. It wasn't until this moment that I realized as an interdisciplinary scholar, the sense of belonging will never 100% be there because we are all wanderers finding safety among the wanderers. In graduate school, I have moved beyond just passively receiving knowledge of what the typical engineer should be to now having opportunities to define what engineering is for myself and for the communities that need engineering the most. It is my hope that communities that I work with feel seen and heard. It is my purpose to be able to make space for marginalized voices in any space that I find myself in, so that the next time I'm asked about my current work, I will not be so conflicted. I will be only proud to tell aspiring young adults aiming to pave a path like my own that I am only proud to be a Black engineer and making an impact on communities that look like my own. Thank you.
Wow, 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 wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sierra, Valerie, Cassandra, Jennifer, Oronde, Carlo, and Taylor for those really inspiring and also informative presentations. We have a few minutes left in this session where you, the audience, can ask questions of these speakers. I see a lot in the chat phenomenal presentation, incredible talent, woot woot, great job, great work, amazing, etc., etc. How about some questions? Anybody want to put a question in the chat? This is some really, really incredible work focusing on so many important topics. Heat waves and their disparate effects on persons of color and the poor, issues with evacuation, issues with immigration, etc.
Kathleen, there is somebody with their hand up too, just so you know.
Yeah. Oh, there is a question coming in from Nenia Campbell, and it has to do with something that was talked about in two of the presentations, which is the engineering disciplines and sort of their sort of inability to understand or appreciate or take on board the societal dimensions of engineering. So how about that? We just heard from Taylor about that, and we heard about that earlier as well. Thoughts from our panelists?
Kathleen, there's also somebody with their hand raised, just so you know. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
Does anybody want to comment on?
I'm so sorry, Kathleen. I'm looking at the chat and I was like, you asked the question. What was the question again? Can you repeat it for me one more time? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it has to do with experiences in engineering classes where they don't seem to be able to appreciate the societal dimensions or the EJ dimensions of the work that they're doing.
Yes. Is it more like okay, I got you. So okay, all right. So for me, it's just having, like, you ask, from what I'm gathering, you're asking like what can faculty and stuff do? Is this based on Ninia's question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Awesome. Okay. That was what I was reading. All right. So for me personally, going through being told like no, this is engineering. No, what are you trying to do? Like this is social sciences. Like this has nothing to do with this. You know, for me, it would be nice if the faculty were open-minded. And it didn't take to like for the racial awakening for them to jump on board, because I even felt like that was even the issue too. It was kind of like, oh, people actually do care about this, but you should have been caring about it from the jump, because again, particularly as I was saying, as a civil engineer, you have to care about people. So it's like for you not to even consider the social sciences, the humanities, none of that is outrageous to me. So for me, long story short, it's just the faculty having an open mind and even just wanting to collaborate the social sciences. For me, it's like one can't be without the other, and I want more faculty to know that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sierra. I'll add to that as well. But I'm looking into the work of Aaron Seck as well, and he talks about this culture of disengagement that is among like training engineers, and it's based on 3 ideological pillars that are like breaking engineers' mindset as far as them separating the social and technical like spaces when we train engineers, and how it's important to integrate the social in everything that we do that's technical. But for some reason that's separated in this idea of meritocracy that I'm pretty sure that is in all academic settings, but especially in engineering, breaking that barrier, and also looking into deep politicalization, and recognizing that a lot of our engineering systems are associated with the political aspects of the world, but at least making that known in the classroom is extremely important, are the 3 things I would start with, but there's so much more to do.
We have a hand up here.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am sitting in my front room and it's a mess in here, so I'm just going to try to keep the camera on the top up. I want to first thank the organizers of this. I am so grateful that you have brought these young people. I have a quick comment and then I have a question. Again, as I thank you for that, I want to also thank my mentor, intersectional scholar, Bunny Thornton Deal, who's a dean at UR Maryland, for encouraging me to keep on working on this project, which I worked on for 16 years since Hurricane Katrina happened. And so my book was released last year, and I encourage you to read it because it addresses a lot of the things that you have mentioned here in this particular session today. So I want to say there are a few of us scholars of color out here, interdisciplinary scholars of color, who are in the academy and outside of the academy. We exist. So my question, young people, how have you been mentored in your programs? You talked about some of the ups and downs, but how have you been mentored? And I just want to stress the importance of that. That is my question. Thank you so much.
Oh, good question. So I see the mentorship in two forms. There's the more overt mentorship from your advisor and or a few other people who may be around and are really interested in, one, making sure that you're okay, and two, making sure that you get through the process. But then for me, one thing I realized, and Taylor brought it up too, I was speaking with other minority students, both in my master's program and then later on in the PhD program. And that informal mentorship of learning from each other and guiding each other through, helping students to figure out how to deal with the dean's office and deal with the ombudsperson when the university forgot and put somebody else's name on the scholarship that you were supposed to have, for example, that sort of thing. And forgot. And then, working through these issues together, building capacities for the later term was one of the things that I think struck me the most, because I didn't realize that was what was happening at the time. It was just one more thing that I had to do that seemingly the majority students didn't have to deal with. And then I got voluntold to be on the DI committee for my department, which changed everything. Because then I had to formally engage in these processes that I was already informally engaging with. But that came from both students as well as my more formal mentors saying, no, you need to do this. You've already got the skills, don't worry about it. And you're exactly the person that we need. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on behind the scenes that I think needs to be recognized, but also a lot of the stresses that we deal with also need to be recognized.
I want to piggyback off of what Arande said. So I got my PhD at Howard University, and going to an HBCU resources is something that's really scarce, and so is mentorship. So my advisor was really stretched thin, so she only gave as much as she can. And so a lot of the mentorship or help that I received came from my colleagues and came from engaging with people in BAF and seeing that there was other people engaged in this work. I was in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and was one of the only people doing this kind of work. So a lot of these things that I was bringing up to my professors was actually really, really new. But what I will say is, because of my experience, I have begun to serve as a mentor because of the things that I've learned that I did not get during my program. I've stepped into the role and has been trying to help, even down to like high school students, in understanding that you can be involved in this work and there are people that look like you and that your work is valid. And so I would say I have become the mentor when it came to this kind of work because of the deficit that I had.
Other thoughts from our panel? MK has her hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to say how impressed I was with all of the presentations. I was just blown away, and I'm so excited that you guys are doing this really important work. I had actually a question for one of you, for Valerie. I was curious for the cell phone data. Did you have any other thoughts on how that data can be used in other kinds of disaster settings, maybe not specifically related to evacuations? It just seems like such an amazing potential to learn more. And so I'd be curious to hear what you think.
I think outside of evacuations in the disaster settings, one of the applications I've seen is on displacement after disasters. And so you can look at how resilient a community is, or how they might recover after a disaster. You could also look at road networks, for example, and partly with recovery, I guess it also kind of ties into evacuations as well. And like the capacity and stuff on the road networks, or the speed, like the flow through. Yeah, I think those are the first two that come to mind for applications that are already being used with the cell phone data. But yeah, I definitely, there are other pathways that can be explored around disasters, with different types of disasters, as well as different aspects in like recovery or evacuation, stuff like that.
A question from the chat. How, as an older white woman, may I best encourage people of color to become engaged with emergency management education? Question for our panel.
Just be present. You need to be present in the spaces that we occupy, or else you're not going to talk to us, and we're not going to listen because we're not hearing it. So just be present. Be there where we are, and we'll be there.
And I think another thing too is that I really want to touch base with this as well. Is like there are already like Black or brown folk already doing the work in emergency management. So they might not be in academic spaces, but they're already doing the work. And that's what, if you actually invest in those particularly their projects, their work already, then I kind of feel like you're shifting again. I think especially with academia, as we move so slow, to actually shift it to like what's actually being done. I think that's even more impactful if you actually like invest and uplift Black and brown people who are already doing emergency management work. And again, like their research, their work isn't called research because I guess it's not like in this academic space, but like they're scholars themselves because they've been through it, they know it, all that. So I would also encourage to also look outside of academia too, and actually find those people again who just need the resources to really get the job done with their needs with emergency management.
I think also make space for their contributions. I know it was like all white women that has helped me. And it took them saying, hey, I see that you're taking this critical race theory class. I know for sure I need critical race theory analysis in my disaster work. You can contribute a lot to this space. And not just like when we come saying, oh, that's not it. That's not what I mean. But like, no, you've learned this and I see value in this space. Thank you for your contributions. It goes a long way.
So as a final question, which came out of the chat, what have you guys learned through the process of preparing your presentations for the workshop today?
I've learned to treat it with care. A lot of the times that we just go into our presentations just talking about research and all these things, but a lot of us are tied our research to our personal experiences. And so we treat our presentation just the way we do with ourselves. I think that's want to be one of the best ways. That's one of the things I learned from Margaret, to slow down and also just breathe, take a deep breath in to make sure that I want to say what I want to say in the manner that I want to. And so treating my presentation with care is the best thing that I've learned from Margaret in this experience. And I really hope that more fellows and other people can learn from these experiences to present on their personal experience and research through in academic spaces or in other spaces as well.
Other thoughts as we get ready to wrap up this session?
Yeah,
Cassandra?
Kathleen. You got it, Cassandra. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, I think the biggest thing that I learned is to keep on fighting imposter syndrome. Even though I do have my PhD, one thing that is kind of difficult is knowing that a lot of people kind of fight your research because it's not really validated. Like, I do a lot of qualitative work, and that's not something that disaster scholars like to tap into. And so having Margaret be like, take up the space, right? In the same way that other people take up space, you can also take up this space and know that you are valid, the research that you're doing is valid, and the way that you're speaking is also valid. And I think that's really, really powerful to have someone speak into you, and then also being with the BAF fellows and working together and validating each other and lifting each other up. I think that's something that's really, really important because we don't necessarily get that in our own spaces all the time. And so I think that's the biggest thing that I've gotten from this project, or this, talk.
Thank you. There's so much more to say, but unfortunately we have to wrap up now. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute yourself for just a second and to give a big shout out to our presenters.
Great job.
Thank you. Great job. Great job.
Thank you.
Hello.
Wonderful.